Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and today's episode is brought to you by our featured patron, Jen Gautreaux.
Hey, Jen.
Today we're going to be talking about the Maginot Line. This is one of history's most famous bad ideas, Tony, and it's also one that was incredibly difficult for me to untangle the truth about.
Those are always the fun ones where you're just like, oh, I've got this perfectly clear bad idea, and then you fall into a research hell for a while.
Yes, I will preface everything I'm about to say by saying that there is some disagreement by historians about the details of how much of this bad idea was to be laid on the actual Maginot Line, which we'll talk about, and how much was just sort of bad luck on the part of the people who would undergo the defeat in this scenario. But if you're not familiar with the Maginot Line, you should know that it was a line of defenses built on the border that France shared with Germany after World War I. The defenses consisted of a series of forts and bunkers of varying sizes dug deep into the ground, heavily armored and fortified. Each bunker was capable of helping to defend the bunkers on either side of it, making the entire stretch of territory defended by the line very difficult for the Germans to attack. So we're in the aftermath of the Great War. We will now call it World War I, but at this time it would have been called the Great War. Everybody's like, wow, that sucked. We don't want it to happen again. We know what happened last time where the Germans all attacked our border. What we're going to do now is we're going to build this giant series of fortifications, and the engineering on this thing is impressive. There are trains going underneath of it to carry ammunition. There are little hatches that pop up and down. The whole system is kept at negative pressure or positive pressure, whichever one, so that the gas can't come in if somebody uses gas because they're not perfectly sealed. They have put a ton of thought and a ton of money into building this fortification.
And this is just something that Patton always hated because he hated mobile fortifications because of things like this.
Well, we're going to get into why someone might hate immobile fortifications as we get into the story. You might guess, based on the fact that we have a bad idea about this, it's not going to work out so well for them if you don't already know this story. But contrary to popular belief, the Maginot Line was never designed to be a completely impregnable wall. The thinking was that if the Germans attacked the line in force, they could eventually overrun it, but the Maginot Line would hold them back long enough for the French army to mount a counterattack. And at first there was this idea that they could keep it secret. So the Germans might think, oh, we'll just walk into France, and then there's all these underground fortifications that the Germans didn't know about, and the turrets pop up and shoot all the French, and they're like, whoa, run away home. But when you're building a giant underground concrete bunker with local contractors, there's going to be some leakage. And so people talk, and the Germans find out about this, and so the strategy changes somewhat. They say, okay, the Germans know about this. Good. This will serve as a deterrent.
It definitely sounds like a solid deterrent. Like, you don't need a robust intelligence agency whenever people are making that big of a stink, like right on your border. But I understand, like, why they would like that ambush style, like, defense.
There's also the fact that there's territory on the French border that keeps changing hands. So there's some territory that they'd gotten from Germany that Germany eventually says, hey, this is ours, give it back. But some of those people who lived in those towns had worked on the Maginot Line. So it was going to be completely porous in those circumstances. The idea that you could keep it a secret was a little bit of a bad idea on its own. But the Maginot Line's still a solid defense. You don't really want to go directly up against this. And I'm going to spoil the end of this story. The Germans really never do. There are some encounters that they have where they do take down some of these forts, but they're just going to go around. And this is actually the plan, the French plan. The French think, okay, the Germans aren't going to attack our giant fortification head on. What they're going to do is they're going to do the same thing they did in World War I. They're going to come in through Belgium, and we're going to meet them there. Because our allies, the Belgians, will coordinate their forces with us. They aren't a big, heavy-duty army type country, but they've got some forts, and we'll send our army in there. And instead of fighting the second war on our soil, like we did last time, and you got to remember, France is where a bulk of the trench warfare happens. It gets so chewed up by World War I physically, and to a much greater degree than Germany did, that they're really excited about not having to have that happen again. And so they think, you know what? Next war going to happen in Belgium.
I'm surprised they got the Belgians to agree to that.
Well, here's the thing, Tony. They kind of didn't. See, Germany starts building up its military, and it starts looking like there's actually going to be a war, and the Belgians decided they weren't really interested in being the padding to protect France from Germany's punches. And so in 1936, they abandoned their alliance with the French and signed a neutrality pact with Hitler. Now, again, if you know this story, you know that that is going to be sort of violated pretty quickly, but the Belgians have an understandable position here. They're like, you want to fight World War II here in our country? Like, we saw what happened to your country. And so France has left this section of border open, initially thinking, okay, Belgium's going to have our backs. Belgium turns their back on France and says, hey, Hitler, please don't kill us. Like, are we cool? Your war's with them, right? We don't want a war. Whatever you want to do, man. And Hitler says, yeah, sure, that's fine. And France sees this and they're like, okay, more Maginot Line. Build more. But at this point, we're in the 30s. It's 1936, and the French are, like the rest of the world, in the midst of the Great Depression. Money is not flowing the way it once was, and so they're not able to build the new section of Maginot Line to the same rigorous specifications that the old section was built. On paper, it looks like the Maginot Line extends all the way through the border with Belgium, but in practice, there's a ton of holes in this one. It's not nearly as well fortified. It's not well provisioned. Any military worth its salt, it's going to be able to find a hole or find the weak link and punch its way through relatively easily. And on top of this, there's another section of the border that the French largely ignored when planning where to put their fortifications. This was the Ardennes Forest. The French believed that the thick woodland would be too difficult for the Germans to move through with their tanks, and if the Germans did manage to penetrate the forest, the high banks of the Meuse River would prevent them from advancing before the French army could respond. So they think to themselves, Ardennes Forest, really thick woods, there's some roads through it. It's not like you're advancing through just woods, but if you're moving hundreds or even thousands of tanks, as the Germans would have to do, you can probably understand why the French thought it was unlikely they would be able to get many troops through this area. And on top of that, there's natural fortifications. When things do look like they're going to ramp up, they put some stuff on the Meuse River on the opposite bank. Imagine, when we're talking about this, the sort of German equivalent of D-Day, but with the French on the other side with not as many provisions as they need as opposed to the Germans. So you're going to have this assault across water toward a high bluff, but the problem is the French don't have the equipment that they need to repel the Germans. They've been sent out there. They've got some bunkers and things, but they're half unfinished. Some of the bunkers don't have doors on the back, so commandos can just walk in and shoot them once they get across the river. They don't have any anti-tank weaponry, so they're just shooting at tanks with machine guns, which, if you're not familiar with tanks, that doesn't work.
Yeah, that's the entire point, and especially the Panzer tanks, because those had great armor on them, especially for the time.
Yes. Now, the reason that the French had to put so much money and time into planning and building defensive measures was because their army was outmatched by the Germans in terms of sheer manpower. So after World War I, the German population was nearly double that of France. And you just do the math, you can see, okay, our army is not going to stand up to their army if it comes to another fight like we just had. We need to be strategic. We need to have defensive plans. And it's understandable why someone like Patton would say, well, these forts aren't that good. But their idea of we'll either stall them or funnel them into the place of our choosing, this is not a bad plan if you have limited resources, which they do. And in addition to not having as many people as the Germans did, just on a numerical level, the army that France did have was often poorly funded and poorly equipped, partly due to France's post-war distrust of quote-unquote professional soldiers. They had just gone through this big war. They thought standing armies maybe were the problem, right? Like, well, maybe if we didn't have these giant armies, it wouldn't be such a big deal.
Yeah, the idea that, like, it's basically like having a hammer and everything looks like a nail. You all of a sudden think about what you can do with your army instead of just kind of rolling it, like, instead of having to provision one and bring it up later.
Yes.
It just becomes a first option.
And in addition to that, France's military command was plagued by political infighting and bogged down with bureaucratic red tape. And this is something that's maybe a little more difficult to see from this side of the war. But you got to remember, before fighting breaks out in World War II, we're judging a lot of this stuff through a political lens. And if you think about how we look at political things today, if you're on the right, you see other people on the right as, even if they're in other countries, as kind of being your team. If you're on the left of politics, you see other people in other countries on the left of politics as kind of being on your team. And since Hitler was on the right, even though people knew that he wasn't great, right? Even though they said, well, this Hitler guy is going too far and we have some problems with him, but those communists really suck. And so during the tenure of socialist French Prime Minister Leon Blum of France, the phrase "better Hitler than Blum" became a rallying cry for his opponents on the right. And in addition to that, the leftists who were willing to gear up militarily against Hitler because he's their political enemy and also because they actually are able to see, oh, this guy really sucks. They're leftists, and they're not so dissimilar from leftists today in that there's a pretty strong pacifist streak in the party. So they're fighting from the people on the right who are saying, y'all just want to have an army so maybe you can take over us, or maybe you just want to punch somebody who's on the same side as us. We don't like that. And then on their own side, there's people who are like, war is bad. We should not have armies. Why are you doing this? And so they end up walking this tightrope where they're not really able to fund the military as much as maybe they would have. And while the French were fighting amongst themselves, the Germans were united in their resentment for the nations that had defeated them in World War I. And this is not an episode on the Treaty of Versailles, but I will mention it in passing. The Treaty of Versailles was essentially everybody who had to fight against the Germans getting revenge on the Germans after World War I. And it causes a major economic problems. It causes them to not be allowed to have a standing army, although they do obviously get around that, but it is seen as a personal strike back at the Germans, and you can understand why you would want to do that after you've just been through the Great War and seen untold destruction like no one had ever witnessed before. Maybe you want to say, hey, Germany, you suck, and you have to go around in public and say how much you suck and not punch anybody and not hit back if you get punched, and also we're taking all your money.
Yeah, it was a brutal policy. Like, I understand why they ended up resenting it so much whenever you just look at the verbiage on it and see what they had to give up. And it's not that it wasn't deserved.
They weren't even allowed to negotiate. All the other countries just went into a room and like, we want them to do this, we want to do this, we want to do this, and they hand them to the Germans and just say, okay, sign it. And the Germans either have to sign it or go back to war, which, as we know, World War I was awfully brutal. It's going to get more brutal, but there's this unifying resentment in Germany that Hitler was really able to tap into. There's also, as we all know, the resentment of the Jews, which, incidentally, the man Leon Blum that I mentioned earlier was a Jewish man. So you have this sort of like, oh, well, you're a Jew, so maybe you're part of this global elite that's planning everything against us. It's not just in Germany where those kinds of things are being said. Now, in World War I, the German plan to invade France was known as the Schlieffen Plan. And in essence, the plan involved making a feint against the French border fortifications to tie down a large part of the French army, and then sending a larger segment of German forces to the north through Belgium, where they would flank and hopefully encircle the French defenders. If you don't know much about military tactics, getting circled around is real bad. You don't want that to happen. If your army is circled by the other army, you just lost. Now, the Schlieffen Plan didn't work as the Germans had hoped in World War I, but nevertheless, they still revived a variant of it for World War II. This time, the French were expecting a fight in Belgium, so the Germans decided that their feint would strike there, and the larger striking flank would come up through the south through the largely undefended Ardennes forest. Now, it's important to remember this is a massively risky maneuver. There is so much stuff that can and almost does go wrong for the Germans. It's kind of frustrating. There were military strategists, proponents of this plan that said it had a 10% chance of working. But they were so desperate to get out from under the thumb of the Treaty of Versailles that they thought 10% was worth it. 10% was better than no chance and just continuing to live in the way that they were living. And so they take the gamble. And it's also important to mention again that in principle, the French plan for the Maginot Line worked. The French knew that the Germans would have to go around unless they wanted to face heavy casualties and be pinned down by this defensive perimeter. And the Germans do in fact go around like the French knew that they would. The Maginot Line did exactly what it was expected to do. The problem was the weakness of French leadership and the unwillingness or inability of the French public to invest in a larger standing army.
Yeah, it's also a little bit of a bad timing issue because of the Depression and not being able to provide those fortifications. So it's like, it's bad leadership, but it's also a little bit of economic conditions that kept it from being the full line that it could have been.
And the interesting thing is, and I'm going to say this and it might not be exactly true, so if somebody wants to write in and say this is stupid, that's entirely possible. But Germany had gone through their depression earlier because of having massive war debts to pay back to all of these countries. The way that they approached this was by hyperinflating their currency and just printing bills to send to pay off the war debt, which doesn't just hyperinflate the debt, right? It also makes all the money that everybody has at home worth nothing. So they kind of have a head start on this Great Depression thing and maybe have a better handle on dealing with it than everybody else who's coming at it later.
I do like the idea that you could just blow up your currency for a little bit, make things hard at home, but you kind of pay things off with a currency that's just, it doesn't really matter anymore. It's play money.
I mean, that was the strategy. They never even did pay it all off, even with the play money. It was too arduous, even with the hyperinflated version of the stuff, because the Treaty of Versailles kind of sucked, as we already mentioned. Now, the French are in a position where they don't really have the resources to face the Germans, but they don't want to think about that. Rather than admit that they're not prepared for a German invasion, the French government turned the Maginot Line into propaganda. They showed that line along the Belgian border and essentially said, hey, listen, everything's fine. We've got these great defensive positions. Look, we drew a line on a map. That's where all our forts are. We're fine. The Germans aren't coming through there, and they're definitely not coming through the Ardennes forest because look at all those trees. Can't get 1,000 tanks through those trees or even 100 tanks. We're probably fine. And so the French public, and I think somewhat by extension, the French military leadership are lulled into a sense of false security. Now, it's not fair to say this entirely. The French are expecting some kind of attack. They are trying to plan for what could be, and some of the historian pushback on this is like, well, they weren't stupid. They had some idea that something was coming. They had some plans. But my read on the situation is they weren't as vigilant as they could have been, even given the circumstances. That's my unprofessional opinion. I am not a historian. Maybe the French really were as good as they could have been and they still got overrun. But it feels like they had some plans. They didn't quite follow through on everything the way they should have. And on top of this, their idea of how they were going to fight the war was just wrong, as it turned out. Most French tanks had no radios in them because it was assumed that they wouldn't be needed in these slow, deliberate movements that French military doctrine prescribed. And many French units weren't equipped with enough anti-tank weapons to defend themselves against attack by German panzers, as I already pointed out. There's also a lot of stuff that comes up about how slow they were to order firearms. They had to get a bunch of different prototypes, and they were very much like, well, let's make sure it's the best thing. And in some instances, that's a good idea, but they were so deliberate that they didn't order enough guns to be ready in time.
That's a little bit of decision paralysis that really would cost them.
Yes. Meanwhile, the German approach was to move fast and strike hard. All of their tanks had radios, which allowed them to have a decentralized command structure where their local commanders, the commanders of the individual divisions, would be able to make decisions and be decisive without running every single decision up the chain of command.
Somewhere out there, I just heard like Jocko Willink nod.
Yep. And that actually comes into play. I don't have this in my notes, but at a certain point, there's an advancing force that could stop at a certain point, and the Germans say, no, we got to even extend further. I believe it's Erwin Rommel who is in charge of this particular division, and he'll go on to be much more prominent in Africa later. But he has his guys do extraordinary stuff that goes even beyond what the plan of attack was, just so he can put a stake down in a better place so that the German attack is more effective. But to back up a little bit, in May of 1940, the Germans put their plan into action, and the French fell directly into the trap. Despite several pieces of intelligence indicating when the Germans were attacking, and air reconnaissance reporting that there were large forces moving through the thick trees of the Ardennes, the French focused their army in Belgium, where they assumed the main assault must take place. And even in Belgium, they were not able to hold their planned defensive positions. There's a lot of waffling about where they're going to make their stand. They're surprised when they get there to find out that the Belgians haven't done a great job of building up their fortifications. And the Germans have a great attack on one of the forts there that involves a glider. It's very ingenious. And so the French are already getting their butts kicked in the place where they were expecting to be able to fight. And on top of that, the main attack is still coming through the Ardennes. The French had estimated that it would take 2 weeks for a major tank attack to move through the Ardennes forest, but the Germans managed it in 2 days. When they reached the Meuse River, in spite of some French resistance, they managed to cross quickly, take out the French fortifications on the other side, and build bridges that would take their tanks into France.
That whole Blitzkrieg thing was unfortunately efficient.
Yeah. And it's impressive to think about. As I mentioned, this is not easy for the Germans to do. You are going through a river with inflatable boats being shot at by machine gun fire from elevated positions on the other side. In some cases, you can imagine they lost some guys here. They pay for this win, but they do manage to get across, and they build these temporary bridges that can hold tanks, so there's all this impressive military engineering that's happening as well. And they do the Schlieffen Plan Part 2, Tony. Churchill will later call this plan the Sickelschnitt, which means the sickle cut. I love the little schnicked onomatopoeia sound because it's German. And they get their tanks up into France. They swing around like a big sickle, like a big arm, and they essentially surround the French army. They force them back to the sea, to Verdun. And if you've seen the movie Verdun, you know how that works out. Some of them do get out. The British forces that are there with them also get out. They're evacuated to Britain. But the people that are left in France essentially have no more army. In effect, They're just there with the Germans in them, and they have no choice but to surrender at this point. Now, I know people like to make fun of the French for being quote-unquote surrender monkeys, and I have some problems with how the French conducted themselves before this point, but what are you going to do? They have an army and you don't. You got to surrender. They're just going to kill you.
Yeah, plus de Gaulle and everybody else ended up setting up some pretty good internal resistance, but there's only so much they could do to stop that.
Yes. And as I mentioned already, the Germans make this look easy, but there's a ton of hard work that goes into this, and it's a hugely risky maneuver. The fact that it pays off makes them look like they're just breezing into victory, but it's a mistake to say, well, this just had to work. The biggest problem, in my mind, is the fact that the French became so target fixated on their plan of fighting in Belgium that they were not able to shift their minds to thinking about what if there's a different type of maneuver. They do nominal fortifications on the Meuse River just in case, but they are not able to adapt their thinking to the new situation, and that is ultimately what fails. The Maginot Line did its job. The leadership failed to do theirs. And that is how France fell, in spite of a very impressive fortification, Tony.
Yep.
I hope that this was enjoyable to you guys. I know that it gets a little bit more technical on some of this stuff to say, well, the Germans got really lucky and they also worked really hard, and the French didn't work as hard and get as lucky. It's maybe not the clearest cut bad idea, but that's the truth that I was able to arrive at least as close as I could. And I think it's still an interesting story. I think the idea of letting yourself get just a little bit complacent, letting yourself get just a little bit target fixated, and having an opponent that is much more willing to be laser focused and fight harder, even if it's just a bit, and take bigger risks, all of those things will come back to bite you. It's not always the obvious thing that you think it might be. Sometimes the opponent is just better motivated. And in this case, the Germans were sure motivated.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, too. Again, this is not about the Treaty of Versailles, but it's easy to see a way, especially in the aftermath of World War II, where the negotiations were very different, and there was a focus on rebuilding rather than retribution, that World War II maybe could have been avoided if we could have gotten past, oh God, everything went wrong and it's the Germans' fault in World War I.
Yeah. I imagine you could probably look up some pretty interesting things on on the most backfired treaties of all time. I bet there's some really interesting ones out there, but I would think that Versailles is probably the biggest.
And hopefully that'll be an upcoming episode, Tony. I almost switched topics when I started reading about Versailles, but I wanted to get the Maginot Line, and that's in our pocket. Versailles will probably be in the future for us. Thank you guys so much for listening. If you enjoyed this, make sure to tell a friend about it. Spread the word about the great job that we are doing telling you about weird, bad history and how not to fail in many, many different aspects of life. I think that there's a great service that we're doing, Tony. People are learning all kinds of stuff that they should not do. And you should spread that value to your friends because they need it too. They're going to fail too if they're not careful. You can also check us out at Patreon at patreon.com/humanechoes, where you can support the podcast and a lot of the other cool stuff we're able to do. We will see you guys next week with another episode of Bad Ideas.
Bye, everybody.